Thank you, Everin. Thank you for that. And I realized I was remiss. I jumped right in without even introducing myself. I am Emily Schwiniger with Smart Growth America, the Deputy Director of Thriving Communities. And I do want to say that this first session in the series of 5 modules that we'll be holding has been a collaboration and partnership over the course of many months, and in fact has shifted due to all of the sort of challenges we've been facing as a country. And so we find ourselves here in this virtual format, and I want to thank everybody ahead in advance for joining us, you know, despite the fact that we're competing with a lot of different virtual programming, and to encourage you all to think about this as an interactive process. We are using Zoom instead of, for example, a webinar format platform, because we do really value the interactive quality of these workshops. So just to let everybody know that originally this would have been a two-day in-person workshop. And so we've had to modify everything based on the situation that we're all facing with the COVID crisis. And so this is where we have landed. And so again, we're really looking forward to interacting with everyone. We have been working closely with the team in Pima County, the health department, the city, advocacy organizations, and the like. And so, you know, we've worked hard to put all of this together with you all, and we're looking forward to getting started. So with that, I would like to start with our opening presentation. I think if Rayla can put that up, we will get started. So I'm going to briefly introduce us to sort of how we got here in this series. Again, you are in the Moving Forward with Complete Streets Implementations session, Module 1 of the Complete Streets, Complete Communities Technical Assistance to Tucson and Pima County. So we are all happy to have you here. Please remember to use the chat when you have any questions, and we will be monitoring that and responding to anything as it comes up. Next slide, please. So a brief introduction, Smart Growth America, we're a community of programs. We work within the spheres of transportation, land use, economic development, and public health and equity. We envision a country where no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. And among our programs are a few you are familiar with: the National Complete Streets Coalition, Transportation for America, State Smart Transportation Initiative, and others. Next slide, please. And so what we do, we work with we empower communities through technical assistance, through advocacy, through thought leadership, to create livable places, healthy people, and shared prosperity. And we work with a series of stakeholders, from elected officials at all levels, real estate developers, chambers of commerce, transportation and urban planning professionals, residents, advocacy organizations, nonprofits, all with this vision of improving everyday life for people across the country. And as the National Complete Streets Coalition, we promote the development and implementation of policies and practices to ensure safe streets for all people of all ages and abilities. We are here as part of the Active People Healthy Nation initiative, which is through the CDC's Division of Nutrition, Physical Activity, and Obesity. And it is planning to help 27 million Americans become more physically active by 2027. Next slide. And this is because the problem has been identified, and I won't sit on this slide very long, because we all know that there is a problem in the United States around people getting the recommended amount of physical activity, and that is affecting people at all ages and all stages of life. Next slide, please. So some of these interventions that have been identified, ways that we can improve the situation and ability for people to get the recommended amount of physical activity at different stages of life, are outlined here. And we are going to be focusing, next slide please, on a very specific strategy to achieve these goals, which is activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations. You can see that these are, you see the signpost in front of you, there's a series of different strategies for getting more people more active in our country. And the one, again, that we are focusing on is at the top of the signpost. You know, among different strategies for activity-friendly routes to everyday destinations, we look at complete streets, zoning policies, safe routes, etc. And I do want to point out an important aspect of this signpost, which is, if you look to the bottom, it is built on a foundation of equitable and inclusive access. So that is fundamental to the work that we do and to the goals and outcomes that we are looking to achieve. Next slide, please. So again, this intervention, activity-friendly routes, is really combining two major categories between the activity-friendly routes, how people are moving around, and the everyday destinations, which are some questions around how we're developing and using our land. And as all of this comes together, next slide, please. What we see are the potential to transform a place into a complete street. So a complete street is a place, complete streets are for everyone, first of all, and they're designed and operated to enable safe access for all users, including pedestrians, cyclists, motorists, and transit riders of all ages and abilities. It makes it easy to cross the street, easy to walk to shops, to school, bicycle to work, and it allows buses to run on time and makes it safer for people to walk to and from train stations, bus stations, or other points of transit. Next slide, please. It's important to point out that Complete Streets is a process, not a product. It's not about any one project. It's about an approach. It's about creating the system and the procedures so that every time you're considering repaving a street or building a new development, then you can apply the Complete Streets approach. And it requires you to consider how to make that project safe and accessible for all users. So with this concept of process versus product, we know that a Complete Streets approach takes time to achieve our goals and objectives. Next slide, please. So quickly outlining what the objectives are for this technical assistance. You know, again, this is something that we would normally be doing in person. We would have opportunities for more interaction. So we want to make the best use of this platform that we can. We will build a lot of discussion into these modules. So, you know, please, again, feel free to use the chat, but also know that we will have open discussions. We'll put ourselves in gallery view. You know, we want to hear from everyone what challenges, opportunities they see as we're moving through the material. So we will have this, you know, we consider it more of a learning exchange. You know, we bring knowledge to the table, but we know that you all are experts in your place. And so we will be hoping to draw out that information from you as, you know, the conversation moves forward. This is, again, next slide, please. This is going to be 5 modules. You can see the schedule here. And the list of the modules, which has been shared with you previously, I'm sure, but we can make sure that that information is available to everyone. But you see, we've scheduled the 5 modules. I want to point out that they are all on Thursdays at the same time, except for the final module, which will be on a Tuesday. And so we recommend and hope that everybody can attend each, but we also know that everybody is busy and managing multiple priorities. So please know that as part of this process, we will be sharing a resource folder with participants at the close of the 5 modules. That resource folder will have copies, PDFs of the presentations. It will also have links to the Zoom recordings, and will also include any reports or resources that are relevant to the material we're covering or that comes up in conversation as well. So that resource folder will be available at the end of the series. Next slide, please. And again, to introduce the instructor team, I am Emily Schwenninger, the Deputy Director of Thriving Communities. We've got some great instructors that you will hear from over the course of the 5 modules. Rayla Bellis, the program manager at Smart Growth America, also Eric Sunkist, the director of State Smart Transportation Initiative, will both be speaking today. Additionally, over the course of the modules, we'll have Cole Sicaro, program manager with the National Complete Streets Coalition, and Beth Osborne, director of Transportation of America. So we're looking forward to having all of these instructors over the course of the 5 modules working with the group. And then for today's agenda, next slide, please. We will start with an overview of why and how to do a comprehensive implementation effort. And then we'll shift into changing process and talk about some common implementation challenges. So I just wanted to give you a brief setting of where we are and what we're planning to do and why and how we have arrived here. And we are really excited to get started. I will hand it over at this point to Rayla. Rayla.
Thanks, Emily. Can you all hear me? Excellent. I'm Rayla Bellis. As Emily said, I'm a program manager with Smart Growth America on our transportation team. I've been with SGA for about a decade, actually a little bit more. I'm approaching my 11-year anniversary on October 5th, which is very exciting. Most of my work over the past few years has been working with local planning and transportation agencies, but actually especially state departments of transportation on complete streets and related efforts, things like coordinating their decisions with land use, figuring out how to best meet the needs of people traveling outside a vehicle as well as people traveling within a car and balancing those needs. I'm really excited to be working with you all. I was sort of observing some of the earlier work that we did with you over the past couple years and really excited to get involved. Like Emily said, I'm going to linger on this slide for just a second. We really see this as a learning exchange. You all are always going to be the experts on your complete streets work and what challenges are coming up. That's always true, and it's especially true in these strange COVID times where we're, not even on the ground there with you. We're zooming in from around the country. I'm based in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is outside of Washington, D.C. So we really want this to be largely discussion-based. Our goal with this series is to help you and support you in moving forward your complete streets work. This first module is going to help inform the focus of the later sessions. We have general topics identified, but we want to, through the discussions during this session, really draw out some of your key implementation challenges and questions that would be most helpful for us to focus on in those later sessions. So we'll be looking to you to really weigh in. As Emily said, I'm going to attempt to do some hopefully brief level setting. We're not going to do like a general intro to complete streets like we would sometimes do in our technical assistance. You all have been doing work on this for years, so we don't need to go over what are the benefits, what are complete streets. But we do want to set a little bit of a foundation for when we're saying complete streets implementation, what do we mean exactly? Why do we think it's so important to do kind of a comprehensive, organized implementation effort like this region has been working on? And just where is Smart Growth America coming from when we're talking about these issues, so you have a little bit of context for our position as we're working with you over the coming weeks. We're gonna we'll have a discussion after that, sort of a general group discussion. In future sessions, we'll likely use the breakout room feature of Zoom, so that'll be fun for this one. I think we're just gonna keep us all together for the sake of time, because we're doing some intro this time around. And then we'll take a 5-minute break between these two pieces, and then Eric Sundquist and I, my colleague, are going to talk about some of the typical challenges that we've seen come up in places that are sort of at a similar point in their process to where you all are. Some of them may not be relevant to you, some of them probably will be, but we want to, again, have sort of a more specific conversation about which implementation questions and challenges are going to be especially relevant for you for the rest of these sessions. So now I will finally move on to the next slide. Oh, there we go. Okay, so this is the level setting portion. So when we're talking about complete streets implementation, that's a phrase that you all use and that I'm going to keep using throughout this session. What we're really talking about is this: moving from your policy commitment to complete streets to building a transportation network that works for everyone in your community, whether they're driving or walking or biking, rolling, taking transit, other modes of transportation. translating that policy commitment into the day-to-day decisions that actually impact what types of projects get built on the ground. So taking that policy and bringing it into practice. Emily showed this map a moment ago of policies that have been adopted around the country, Complete Streets policies. Up until relatively recently, this was one of the big focuses of the National Complete Streets Coalition's work. It still is a focus, but this was one of the primary focuses. As this momentum started to build around Complete Streets policies, it became clear that in a lot of communities, the policy itself was a great catalytic step, but it wasn't actually leading to the changes on the ground that those communities were hoping to see. There was additional work that needed to be done to actually change those practices before investments could really look differently. And it wasn't always obvious exactly what those changes needed to be or who would lead them or how to actually move them forward in a coordinated way. So we started to shift our focus more fully to implementing policies that are on the books. Ultimately, you know, we're trying to change what gets built. For decades, we've invested in our transportation systems around the country in ways that look a lot like this, that, you know, tend to create hostile environments for people traveling outside of a car. The same can be said for the way that we've made land development decisions in a lot of the US over the past few decades. So we're trying to change investments. That is the ultimate purpose here, and not just individual projects, but we're working up to a network approach where we're creating a system so that people can, you know, whether they are unable to drive or can't afford to own a car or choose for whatever reason not to drive, they can actually meet their daily needs, as Emily said, by other modes of transportation. So not just, you know, taking recreational trips by cycling, but actually creating that full network where someone could take transit to work, take their bike to school, walk to the grocery store, and actually accomplish their daily trips with options. Policies, obviously, this isn't new information. This is work that you all have done and are in the process of doing. Policies are obviously key to getting that network in place. There are so many, well, some examples of great catalytic, like local complete streets projects that happened through the motivation of, you know, city staff and elected leader champion, strong advocacy community getting a really good project in place. And that can actually have, you know, transformative effects in terms of building support for complete streets and buy-in. It's always going to be piecemeal, of course, without the policy, because as those motivated staff and decision makers move on or the political winds shift, you're not going to get the network that you're looking for. Policies, the reason they're so important is because they codify the practices that need to be in place to make sure that the projects that happen routinely and consistently are actually creating those networks of streets that work for everyone. And when we're talking about implementation, again, this is where we're focused on what are those practices that need to change. Your design guidance, you know, the project development process, land use decisions, all the little pieces that will continue to operate as usual until you actually go in and intentionally update them to align with your complete streets policy. Part of the reason that this has become such a big focus of our work is because as difficult or as much foundational work as it can take in some communities to adopt a policy, you know, it takes a lot of political will. Sometimes it can take several years of building community support and education to get to the point where you have a strong policy like you have an ordinance on the books. This step can be even, you know, as challenging, if not more so, to actually change the specific day-to-day decisions that are happening and the culture that's leading to those decisions can take as much political will, as much leadership, as much buy-in, even more so. So it really does take a concerted implementation effort, not a sort of piecemeal, we'll tackle this here, we'll tackle this there. It's not going to move forward without that real concerted effort. So it's great that you all are doing that. You know, typically part of the reason that we need to really dig into our practices and see what needs to change is because by default, even when we know this isn't ideal, this is sort of what we're set up to do in transportation decision making, is create these types of environments where cars can, you know, travel quickly through the area, ideally without slowing down. They don't even have to stop for this right turn, but at the expense of people walking in this case. Even, again, knowing that this is creating a dangerous situation for the pedestrian, everyone who works in this field knows this, all of the structures that underlie transportation decisions and land use decisions, the metrics, the standards, just the assumptions, the focus, all is prioritizing car travel, and not just car travel, but car speed and throughput, and putting that emphasis there. So when we're doing complete streets implementation, it's not actually just enough to say, okay, we're also going to start talking about prioritizing the other modes. There's actually some work and a paradigm shift that needs to happen, where you're looking at what practices that are currently happening are standing in the way, that are creating the hostile environments that will need to actually be sort of tweaked and updated to prioritize everyone in your system. This probably isn't news to anyone, of course, but we're seeing this national epidemic of pedestrian and bicycle fatalities. Streets are getting more dangerous because of the way we design our streets by default. We release this research every couple years or so about the most dangerous places to walk in America, and overwhelmingly it tends to be the states with communities that developed during or after the widespread automobile ownership took place in the middle of the last century, so that the land use is more car-oriented. The streets, are more car-oriented. So this is a legacy that I'm sure you all are grappling with here. That's a real challenge. And in order to address some of that, again, it's really about changing the DNA of how we're making decisions. So it's not just layering a complete streets approach on top of what's already happening. It's actually shifting the way that we're making planning and transportation decisions toward people-oriented transportation decision-making, towards actually encouraging active transportation, not simply sort of doing the bare minimum to accommodate it, but supporting the modes that we know have all these other benefits, like environmental and public health and equity benefits, cost of transportation, actually incentivizing that shift through our practices. When we sort of moved our focus as a movement from policy adoption more towards policy implementation, we refined the list of implementation steps that the Complete Streets Coalition recommends, and you all are familiar with them because you've written them into your own policy, so I'll just go through them super briefly. And I know that you all have some of these already going on, but just to provide sort of an overview, planning for implementation is really important. That's the part where you actually establish specific activities and deadlines and milestones and task leads. That's what actually allows you to see what progress you're making and making change. Updating design guidance so that it integrates the complete streets approach and balances the different modes of transportation. Doing an evaluation or an audit of other procedures, plans, and regulations that are currently working at odds to the intent of your complete streets policy, whether that's land use regulations, that's a common one, zoning, digging into the project development process to see, are the right questions coming up at the right points? Are the right people being consulted early enough? Are we actually identifying the needs of these different modes in the point in the process where we need to support them? Providing training, I think, is self-explanatory. Having oversight, so having a multidisciplinary and ideally also involving members of the community group, kind of checking in at key milestones during implementation, as you all are doing in the groups that you've pulled together. Doing proactive, robust, meaningful, inclusive, and social or culturally relevant community engagement plans, so that community engagement consistently is not a box checking exercise, and is actually, meaningfully incorporating the needs of the people that you're serving. Performance measures, this is ways to measure the progress towards changing your practices. So it can be things like changes to infrastructure, like miles of bike lanes and sidewalks added. It can be changes to behavior, if you can measure that, like whether people are walking and biking more. And then it can also be the broader goals that are built into your policy around public health and economic vitality and equity and safety. And obviously you can't really isolate the impacts of your complete streets policy on those things, but you could still track trends in what's happening. And then updating your criteria used to prioritize which projects receive funding. We'll talk about that in a subsequent module. You all, there we go. you all are already doing lots of this in some capacity, and these are just the ones that I know of. I'm sure I should have highlighted training too, I guess, for today. You can tell me when we break for discussion in just a moment what else you're doing, but we already know that you've done some, at least some level of sort of broader implementation planning. You have your revised or your new draft design guidance that integrates a complete streets approach throughout, is context sensitive. You have your oversight through your coordinating counselor and your technical review committee, and of course your city staff that are all involved in implementation in different ways. You've done some ongoing engagement around this. You're launching a process to update or develop new project selection criteria for your upcoming long-range plan. Oh, actually, here, can you go back? Yeah. One thing I wanted to mention just is number 2, which you may already be working on. I didn't highlight it. I think this is where our technical assistance almost always ends up really focusing. This is sort of a catch-all category that's actually fairly complex to figure out exactly what needs to change. There are some, sort of consistent things from community to community. Like I mentioned zoning before, often, the zoning ordinance needs to be updated at least in some fashion. That's one that, people are usually fairly aware of. I mentioned the project development process. That can be a little bit harder to figure out. A lot of that sometimes isn't even written down very specifically. So actually identifying where the decision points are that are causing, the needs of people who are traveling outside a card not to be considered soon enough. Some of that's even just cultural, like decision-making culture that isn't really spelled out, but is just how a place has always done things. That's usually where we need to really dig in. And that's gonna be what we start to talk about in the second half of this session as we talk about common barriers. So I just wanted to flag that. I was gonna talk about a couple specific examples, but for the sake of time and not bombarding you with presentations, I will just say, from what we've seen of other places that are trying to do similar things, where they're doing sort of a broad implementation push with different pieces that are moving forward simultaneously and it's organized, that's really important, and it's important to kind of keep it up for a sustained amount of time, because if any of these pieces that need to be in place sort of drop off, it can really slow down or cripple your efforts to make changes to how you're building your streets. We've seen examples where an implementation process was going really well, and then the really motivated leadership who was championing it moved on to a different position, and it just lost a lot of the momentum because it just didn't have that vocal high-level support pushing it forward. People kind of go back to their standard ways of doing business. Even if you have good written standards in place, if the process hasn't really been updated to align with those, sometimes they just don't really get implemented in the right way. The culture of, staff, but also just your stakeholders and what they're asking for you, from you in terms of what they want for their community. If that's not really supporting the work you're trying to do on complete streets, all of that can end up kind of, really stagnating the work that you're doing on implementation. So in other words, another way of saying it's really important to do what you all are doing to keep up a sort of concerted, intentional effort with staffing behind it and leadership behind it and engagement, and to keep it going. So that was a lot of talking, and I'm done with level setting. So we wanted to have sort of a general discussion at this point. Like I said, we're gonna get into more specific questions about specific implementation challenges with the second half of this. But before we do that, I did want to get a sense. We're gonna exit the screen share in a second. I'll paste these questions in the chat. In general, I highlighted some things that I know you all are doing, but what else do you feel like is really moving forward successfully in your complete streets implementation efforts? What do you feel like, okay, we've got this, like we're making change, we're institutionalizing this practice, it's going great. Are there, specific barriers or gaps that have come up? Is there anything that's sort of stalled out? And if so, why? Is it, cultural, political, what's coming up? And then do you have any big questions that you're hoping that we're gonna answer through this series of sessions? So again, this is pretty open-ended. I'm gonna exit the chat. I'll ask my colleagues who are on to also jump in and respond. Okay, stop sharing. And now I will paste these questions in the chat. Any initial thoughts? Maybe we could start with, did I miss anything big that's going on in this region with your Complete Streets work? Is there anything that I don't, that we're not aware of that's moving forward really well that we should know about?
I can jump back to the first question, I think, in terms of what's going well. This is Patrick Hartley. I can turn my video on as well. I'm not a disembodied voice, but I think the institutional support and the support of leadership is really strong. So as we, as staff, are going forward and looking to make these changes, we know that we have a direct line to the director's office. She's very committed to making sure that we're implementing this program and that it's transformational, as well as at the mayor and council level, passing the policy, which gives us a really strong foundation, as you mentioned, for making sure that we have the space and kind of the ability to move these forward. And we're not, working against ourselves as a city, as a department, that we have the clear direction from leadership. So the work that went into that and the policy development has been absolutely beneficial and effective at paving the way for us. Would add as well as having the community organization on board, the Complete Streets Coordinating Council together, and really starting to dig into this information has been great in getting the community perspective. It's been kind of I think it was a little challenging out of the gate, just building it up, trying to do a different committee as was written out in the initial policy, on top of then having to do a completely virtual, not meeting for a number of months. But we've met for the last 2 months in a Zoom conference, and I think the committee is really starting to take hold and engage with the materials and take ownership of the implementation. So it's exciting to see.
Here, I'll say words.
All right.
So I'm Scott Clark. I'm the Director of Planning and Development Services, and I spent about 35 years in Washington State. And we went at Complete Streets from a different angle because our land use policies were killing off all the fish. So we had to come at it from how do we reduce impervious surface, which was reducing the width of streets, creating lots of tree-lined streets, lots of infiltration opportunities. And during the process of going down that road, there was a lot of research performed that came out that suggested that tree-lined streets, people tend to hang around longer and shop, spend more money. So it's good for your business environment. So we have the policy guidance to move forward. And as Patrick mentioned, there's support from the key leadership. I think the barriers in Tucson, one is heat. Trying to get people out of cars and onto bikes and onto footpaths and even on the public transit when it's 108 is a challenge. And I think our transit system, there's a bus stop out here by where I live on Irvington, and it's a pole with a sign in the dirt. There's no shade for 1,000 yards, right? So how do you ride something like that? The other part I think that's a barrier is just the enormity of Tucson's problem. We're a large, sprawling desert city with a huge aircraft carrier size road infrastructure that we're gonna have to change. And that's the process that's gonna take a lot of time. And so we have to be in this for the long game. And I think we're gonna have to point at milestones and successes as we get there to say this is where we're trying to go the entire city. So, it's just the amount of work to be done to flip Tucson into a multimodal friendly environment. It's the heat. How do we address that? Because, and I think that gets back to some of the land use components we need to take a look at. It's not just transportation. It's about not having to move so far to get to essential services. So grocery, medical, dentist, whatever. Again, because, you know, once you're, say, in your late 50s and early 60s, trying to carry groceries, again, when it's 104 is painful. So it's going to be a combination, I believe, of land use and transportation policy that leads to the better products. And we're going to be in it for the long game. I think that we need to be hunting federal grants because we won't be able to do it alone at every step of the way. And we need to talk and show this stuff all the time, what successful streets look like. The fear that will be in Tucson is I can drive 80 on most residential streets without much problem whatsoever, other than I'm going to hit a kid eventually. But the fact that the roads are so big, I can do that. So, you know, one of the things that came out in clearing up misinformation, I think, is key. One of the things we learned early on was, you know, if you narrow the streets, there's going to be more crashes. But the reality is when you narrow the streets, there's a lot less crashes. What was sad about that research was people slowed down so they wouldn't dent their cars as opposed to hitting pedestrians. But whatever it takes to achieve the effect. So I think that's it. You know, the size of Tucson, a history of large, wide streets, and then our heat. I think those are going to be key barriers. I've said words now. I shall
Those
stop.
were great words. That's really helpful. And I did want to call attention to the point you just made about really publicizing the milestones and the successes that you have. We've worked with places that do really public complete streets efforts. We've also worked with places that kind of try to like slide it under the radar of the opponents of complete streets. The former, I would say, is always much more successful. So I agree with and applaud your comment about that. Other thoughts? Yeah, go ahead.
I'll chime in since I'm already a little warmed up. So just maybe a comment on the community engagement piece. You highlighted it as one of the things that is moving forward. And it is in the sense that, you know, the Complete Streets Coordinating Council is really one thread in community engagement, and that's been formed, which is really exciting. And also as part of the Move Tucson initiative, the folks at the city are, you know, really kind of trying out some different ways of community engagement now, working with community ambassadors. So these are all really new and exciting developments. And I would add to that I think creating a community engagement plan to sort of institutionalize what inclusive, equitable, meaningful, and transformative community engagement looks like beyond the Move Tucson initiative going forward would be something that I would think the city would really benefit from and the community would really benefit from.
Thank you.
All right, I'll jump in. I'm Ann Schnecke. I'm the Deputy Director of Housing and Community Development, sort of filling in for Liz today, but would probably have been here anyway. So one thing coming from now that I'm coming from housing, which is still new in my brain, one thing that I think is working, but I think can also be a challenge is the transportation department's focus on integrating some of the work they're doing. So with the transit-oriented development and equitable mobility development, I'm getting EMOD screwed up. I think that there are a lot of different initiatives going on, and kind of bringing it all together under Complete Streets is something that I've been really encouraged by. I think that a challenge in implementing Complete Streets in an equitable way is the community's growing concern for good reason about gentrification. And so I think that there is definitely groups of people that will see street improvements as something that can displace people. And so just trying to figure out how to make sure that as we move forward, we're thinking of all voices and how to have people not feel as threatened by improvements to streets in what has traditionally been disinvested in areas.
Such a great point.
So this is Robin Rain. I'm the Deputy Director or one of for Transportation and Mobility. And thank you so much for that opening. Jen and I just listened to value capture for the city of Atlanta, and they have that Beltway going on, and they were able to strategize, and I mean they're always looking to improve, though, using all of their departments. In other words, the connection we have to PDSD here, to housing, and make sure that as we do these improvements that are supposed to help the economy, what are some of the kinds of things we can do by including all of the other departments to ensure that we don't displace the legacy owners in those areas. And so I think we owe it to ourselves to not only think about it, like you mentioned, in the networks of the streets, but how that affects the adjacent. So I'm glad to see everybody here, because we have to think about all of that.
Other thoughts? We have one in the comments. Selena, would you be willing to speak a little bit to what you just posted in the comments in the chat?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, just kind of piggybacking on the comments that were made earlier about Tucson. I agree, it's so sprawled, and just the width of streets, I think, is important, almost like Complete Streets 101 to the community. Like, what are complete streets? What are these elements? What's like street design? What are street, furniture? Just kind of simple lingo to the community, so folks don't get scared of these changes, because I think looking in the future, Tucson's gonna have some rapid changes pretty soon, especially during this time of COVID. And I think there's just been a lot of chatter of the fear of, displacement and amenities kind of shifting. So kind of looking at it more in a holistic model. How can we tie in our community partners, but also different departments within the government sector, and just relay that message of what are complete streets to the community, and what are the myths, what are the confusions around it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just one more thing. I think it's great that the city's being more transparent and like involving folks like the street ambassadors, and I'm a Complete Streets member, so it's awesome to be part of the process. So I think it's new to a lot of community members, and to a lot of folks that have historically not been at the table. So I think, little steps before you show the massive design of, hey, this is going to be the complete street where the sidewalks were. So kind of just like little approaches to get to that big picture, so folks aren't overwhelmed. Because what I see here in Tucson, I mean, I lived in LA for 10 years, and I'm from Tucson, born and raised. But in LA, it's very fast paced. You see construction all the time. You see streets kind of get tore up a lot. Here in Tucson, the process is really slow, and I think some folks also get a little discouraged with the pace of development. But I also think people get very nervous with changes too, because our process has historically been more lengthy.
Thank you.
So I think that one of the keys to success is going to be bringing in the faces I see on the screen here that are not my age. Because when I go to public meetings, I know everyone there by name, and they know me. And that's what shapes the policy for the city, is baby boomers vested in a certain way of the city looking and wanting it, a whole bunch of them, to stay exactly that way. So in developing your outreach, getting to the group here that has the younger faces and is going to show up at the mayor and council and the county supervisors and the planning commission and testify is really probably the most critical thing you can do. because who comes to play wins. And you may have a great policy that's been well vetted by the zoning examiner, the planning commission, the subcommittees, but if you don't show up at council in numbers and talk why this is a good idea, and they do show up at council in numbers and talk why it's terrible, you lose, especially in Tucson. So as you move this forward, you need to bring Selena and everybody of her age into this discussion, because I have had plenty of fights in Tucson that were for progressive development, dense infill, going vertical, and man, I get the stuffings kicked out of me. So please come along for the ride, because this will get harsh at some point. And matter of fact, don't come along for the ride, drive the bus, I'll sit in the back and help. But I'm glad to see so many young faces here, because the public meetings I go to, so many times you're not there. And I know it's a difference in generations in how we communicate. And we recognize that. So as we design our public outreach, it's got to be to where it's a Big Ten approach, but targeted at getting people into it and providing feedback. Because when you're retirement age, you have all day to research and spend on a computer and write a constitutionally sound counter argument that sounds very elegant, that unhinges 2 years of policy work. So come on, come with us.
I think that's a really good point. It also speaks to the way that you structure your engagement to actually make it possible and easier for those folks that aren't, typically participating in the meetings to weigh in a way that actually works for them and isn't a huge barrier, which we likely will talk about in a later module.
If I can just add to that real quick, I think Riley just captured what I was going to say, but yeah, Scott, I think all of the things that you're saying about, certain populations not being represented in the decision-making space is a huge deal, and it's a huge barrier. And that's really sort of what was behind my comment earlier too, about like that more, institutionalizing that sort of community engagement and identifying the barriers, and just like Rayla said, figuring out ways where we take the conversation to the people in culturally relevant ways and in inclusive ways. And for people who are not maybe able to come to the table for various reasons, how do we take the conversation to them, meet people where they are? I think there's a lot of rich conversation probably to be had there, and some complex work that we all probably hopefully be doing soon.
So in a couple minutes here, we'll transition to our brief break. Unbelievably, we're already an hour in, and we have other material to cover, more discussions to follow after this. Other thoughts on general barriers? This has been exactly what we want to hear. Your sort of overarching feedback of what you think the biggest challenges are.
I got a quick thing. And last night at the Complete Streets Coordinating Council, Patrick provided us with this really great presentation, which was some of the feedback from the surveys that they had done. And one of the things that really stuck with me was that there was like overwhelming support for safer streets. And I want to say, and Patrick might know for sure, is it like 58, 68% of people, something like that, I think was one of the figures. But then the thing that registered the lowest, that was like 22%, was slowing down. And so to me, kind of what that says to me is that people are willing to support and even throw money at infrastructure that will provide safety, but not at the cost of them actually having to just slow down, which is like the cheapest, quickest thing that you can do to just save lives, is just don't drive so fast. And the whole idea of like the magical crosswalk that's going to somehow allow you to just keep, driving around at this breakneck pace, but then also nobody ever gets hurt. So that was one of the things that just like, it's like always like, yeah, people actually they really just don't want to have to slow down. But anyways, that's what I see. So.
Excellent point. Yes.
All right.
Nope.
I'll let Jonathan go.
Thanks, Anna. And just real quick, I hadn't heard anybody mention in terms of barriers that I can't speak for the City of Tucson Transportation Department engineers, which I think are doing a good job. But I think as a community in whole in Tucson, I think the engineering community, the traffic engineering community is a barrier because I think number one, they really are biased towards vehicles and moving traffic. All the standards that have been in place for many years are designed around that, and so I think there's a lack of understanding and appreciation. I think there's a disbelief, frankly, on some of the data that's out there that shows that, you know, putting trees and roadside obstructions is actually a benefit in terms of slowing travel speed and forcing drivers to pay more attention than these ridiculously wide streets that we continue to design to this day. So I think the engineering component is a major barrier, and I think that carries over into the community in terms of a general bias and understanding and lack of appreciation and willingness to go with what I think a lot of people think of as really avant-garde, out there, complete streets malarkey. So unfortunately.
Malarkey. Anne, did you want to jump in with an additional comment?
Sorry, I can do this. So I don't work for transportation anymore, so I feel like I can bring up a challenge that I've observed over the last 15 years in this community. I think the city is doing a fantastic job at prioritizing complete streets. And I think being in a more urban environment, it's in some ways easier for the city to make that its emphasis. I think the rest of the region, in some cases for good reason, it's more rural, more suburban. The rest of the region is not quite there in terms of prioritizing complete streets and funding for complete streets projects. Mm-hmm. So I bring it up because moving forward, some regional MPO decision makers, and I see that one's here today, and he's a good one. But I think that moving forward, there has to be better collaboration and coordination in making sure that the city's interest and need in complete streets gets prioritized for regional initiatives and regional funding.
Thank you. Last thoughts at this stage on barriers?
I think that might be a cue for me to say something. I'm Paul Casertano with Pima Association of Governments, and I would totally agree with that. And I guess to add a little bit to Jonathan's commentary, I think there's opportunity in the engineering community. I'm not an engineer, I just play one on TV, and I also provided therapy sessions for traffic engineers for many years in committees, and they're apprehensive. Mm-hmm. But I think there are opportunities for openness amongst some of them. So we need to think of it that way. They're pretty set in their ways, but there are others that are willing to learn, and we need to kind of capture those champions and work with them closely to move these things forward.
I'll share a story that we were successful with the fire department. Chuck Ryan, our fire chief, is here, but one of the approaches, I took when I was younger, like in my 30s, was I knew everything and I was going to tell everyone else how it needed to look. But I learned I was wrong. It took a while, about 10 years, I think. But finally, I went back to my fire department and I said, how low can you go? And they were very deliberative about it. They came back later and they said, if you give us a 13-foot wide, and this was a one-way street we were talking about, 13-foot wide right away with a pullout every 150 feet, we can do that. And everyone else but the fire department had told me they would never go there. But when asked directly, how low can you go? They came back with an answer that was lower than anyone else anticipated. And the 150 feet was hose pull. So they had technical things they had to work with. I'll challenge Chuck with getting an attack pumper that's only about a ton, or maybe even a drone that puts out fires, but we've had some of this discussion before. But you know, it's challenging paradigms, but giving the group that own those paradigms the opportunity to change them on their own. You know, the other thing we ran into when we were looking at lots of trees was we heard people say, well, the cops will never go for this because they can't see the homes, and so the security go bad. So on the land use side, we oriented the homes so they faced each other. And that was at the recommendation of the police, because they said homes watching homes is the best security ever, as opposed to a patrol car once every 3 days. So again, it's challenging the people with the paradigms to break their own paradigms. And I think that's true of traffic engineers, because if you give them a more amusing design to work on and something challenging, most engineers will take that up, because you got to admit Tucson's road standards, you know, 3 lanes wide, 150 miles an hour. It's fairly simple. It's a straight template. We use it over and over again. So.
Thanks. Yeah, that's kind of classic. I feel like people who have apprehension about these changes often evoke like the fire department or like the trucking community. And if you actually go to those stakeholders, a lot of times it's not the boogeyman that, that people say it's going to be. So. Okay. I love this so much. I almost don't even want to move us along, but we're going to keep having these conversations. A lot of these issues are going to come up again in the slides that Eric and I are going to walk through in a couple minutes, and we'll pause a couple times for discussion throughout that. So let's take a short 5-minute break, and then we'll come back at 5:10, and we'll try to kind of fly through and jump right into discussion again about some of these common challenges that we've seen in other places. Thanks, everyone. This is great. See you in 5:10. I'm sorry, 2:10, your time, 2:10, Mountain Time. Great. See you soon. All right. It is 2:10 your time. If folks are starting to come back, we're gonna get started again in just a moment. This is always the challenge with breaks. All right, I'm seeing some videos coming back, so I'm gonna assume that folks are returning, whether or not they're turning their video back on at this stage. So what we're gonna do now, Eric and then I are gonna go through a few of the implementation challenges that we see come up a lot, like I said, in places we've worked elsewhere around the country, some of which probably will resonate with you. Some of these issues are topics that have already started to come up in the discussion, so this will be an opportunity to go a little bit deeper on some of those. Hopefully we'll get through all of it, but if not, we're gonna just have a great conversation regardless. Can folks hear me? I just wanna double check. Yes, great. Excellent. Okay, so with that, I think I am going to hand it over to Eric and I will share our slides again. And let's do it.
Thanks, Rayla. I'm glad to be here with you guys today. This has been really interesting. My name is Eric Sundquist. I am the director of the State Smart Transportation Initiative. As the name implies, our main work is with state DOTs, also large MPOs and municipal DOTs. We've done a lot of work with LA DOT, for example, but state is our main focus. But in my off hours, I have worked a lot at the local level, both in the Atlanta area where I lived before and here in Madison. I've been on the Plan Commission in both places, been on transportation boards. I work a lot with city council members. It's sort of on a volunteer basis. So that lived experience is probably as useful to me here in listening to you guys talk about these challenges, because I've gone through a lot of those too. And so I will say that the big challenge of heat is not one that we have in Madison. On the other hand, I don't think you guys have to worry about whether you plow the bike path of snow before the neighborhood streets and who will yell at you one way or another. So there's a trade-off there. Just in listening to the conversation, it sounds like I've already got some ideas about how we might alter our plans for our next modules that we've already sort of talked about, because there was a lot around organizing and outreach and information and misinformation, getting people to meetings, and all of that sort of thing. And our emphasis in what we had talked about before wasn't as much on that. But there was also a fair amount about standards. There was conversation about transportation engineers and how they work. And so I think we're going to probably be more on that side of things right now, but that doesn't mean that's the way all these modules are going to go, and can certainly do a course correction for the rest of them. And my experience with questions of standards has been long and often frustrating, as folks alluded to. But when I moved to Madison and joined the Plan Commission here and was on the transportation board, there was a transportation engineer named Tony Fernandez who was just like fantastic. He was, there was not a design issue that he couldn't at least improve to a large extent. And so through him and some other good leadership in transportation engineering, Madison went from having a bike mode share to work of essentially zero in around 2000 to around 6% today, which 6% sounds like, well, that's not very many, but that's a big chunk. There are not that many transit systems in the country that carry 6% of commuters. And we don't really know what our mode share is for non-work travel on bike, but I would say it's more than that 6%. So just on bike, and he also did some some ped work. As an example, we actually have bicycle congestion in some places on our paths because it is in certain places very popular. So there's a place near one of our lakes where the bike path goes over a bridge, and it was a bottleneck because the bridge deck was narrow, and it would be really expensive to widen the bridge. And it's just like people are actually having crashes, bike to ped crashes, bike to bike crashes, annoyance. And Tony looked at it and figured if we just pushed the guardrail out, we get like 6 or 8 more inches, and that's enough to make it like much better. And it was. So it was like a very simple solution, and it took, you know, just somebody with creativity and the will to do it and not to blow it off. Unfortunately, Tony retired at some point a few years ago. And the people who took over, I won't mention their names, but they didn't ride bikes. They didn't know, you know, the conditions. They would not have looked at that bridge and intuitively known what the problem was or how to solve it. Let's just say that the performance has not been as good since Tony departed. And so we have a lot of issues where that could be useful in discussions here going forward, just around governance. So does our Transportation Commission have to weigh in on every single project to make sure our transportation engineers are doing what they want? Are there ways to, you know, and we do have good transportation engineers. I don't want to like, but there are trade-offs of different stakeholders, people who insist that if we take out 2 parking spaces to accommodate bikes and peds, that's the end of the world. But we do have a strong bike and ped advocacy group here too. So all of that is throat clearing and just to like let people get back to their seats. And so now we'll go on to a few of these things that might prompt some more responses about like what the barriers are that we should address in our modules. So Rayla and I, in our experience, that, you know, some of my lived experience and her lived experience in our work around the country, sat down and kind of came up with a bunch of common barriers to implementation of complete streets. And we don't have time today to go through all of them because in a few minutes we came up with like 20. So we bunched them into like 5 different buckets here. We thought we would just go through them. We're not going to be kindergarten Socratic and ask you like to respond to these pictures, but we'll just sort of narrate them, pause in the middle, get a reaction, like, yes, that's really on point for Tucson and for the county and the region, or no, we don't, you know, that's not really it. We can check that box and not worry about it. Or that made me think of something else. So just to tease out a few more things that we want to address in this training. And then we'll do a few more of these, and then we'll do another round of that, and then we'll call it a day pretty much. So Rayla, you want to advance to the next slide? So there's no official you know, list of you know, barriers to complete streets. So these are again the buckets that we came up with. One is, you know, we're going to accommodate these bikes and peds and transit users and wheelchairs, but really that's kind of an empty gesture almost. So next slide. So sometimes you get sometimes very expensive facilities. Like there was a thing in the chat about dollars. That pedestrian bridge there was probably not very cheap. Probably also not going to get used very much. You got to climb all the stairs, walk across, climb back down. Not clear how a wheelchair would do it at all if they could. Maybe there's an accommodation there, or carrying a bike if you're going across on a bike. So probably most people are still going to like pick their way across and take their chances with the traffic, which in that picture there isn't very much, but that means probably the cars are going a lot faster than 35. So you know, sometimes the over-designed solution is not the best solution. I do see somebody on that bridge, so it's not 100% washout, but you know, I bet whoever came up with that thought they had really bent over backwards and gone to the, you know, as far, you know, really accommodated, so to speak, bikes and peds, when often these things don't. Same thing on the right. This is from Florida, where they did make a good effort to revise their standards. They have something called multimodal level of service, which is pretty famous around the country. So they don't put in facilities without bike lanes most of the time now. But is that a bike lane that would actually be used? Is it wide enough? You've got, it's hard to tell even how many lanes of traffic there is there. It looks like at least 4 going away from us, including this turn lane that looks like it's going to turn over the bike lane right up ahead. Not very inviting. We talk about when we do our metrics, when we go out to state DOTs and they want to prioritize projects or develop projects, we talk about level of traffic stress. And we measure that in different ways. How fast are the cars going? How far is the separation from the cars? And this one is right up next to the cars. They're probably going pretty fast. And, even though it's an accommodation, probably only the boldest bike riders are going to use it. So probably didn't move the needle very much in terms of really completing the streets and the built environment. Next slide. Here's one. If you look on the right there, you've got a bus stop. That's great if you're getting off, well, kind of. If you're getting off on the right side of the road, you don't really have anywhere to walk to because other than the pad for the bus stop, you got a goat path to get on down the road to wherever your house is or whatever it is. But if you're going to this strip mall or whatever it is on the other side of US 70, you're on your own. You either have to probably walk a long way to get to the nearest signalized intersection or take your chances. So an example of a standard that has been put into place recently to address this accommodation without accommodating situation comes from our friends in MassDOT. So there you have a standard that says for every bus stop or subway stop, any transit stop in the region on one of their facilities, there has to be a crossing within 250 feet. And if there isn't, anytime they go in and work on that road, they have to improve it to add that. So it's a rhetorical question, what's wrong here? But this is a way that sometimes you can follow standards that sound like things are complete. Here we do have transit, but do we have transit service that is useful? Not really. Next slide. So sort of a different nuance, but almost the same sort of problem is that sometimes transportation, we think of them strictly as improvements and that we're just going to add it on. We're going to have whatever we had before, but the complete streets gets kind of glommed onto it. That was probably the root of the problem, some of the examples from up above. The question in the chat from before about the money may imply this paradigm. I don't know. The person may have many other things in mind, but if you're thinking that complete streets are what we got before, but something new on the side. So even a wider right of way than you had before, but now it has a bike path in it. That might not lead to the right outcomes either. So next slide. So what happens? Rayla and I had a long and still unfinished project with the folks at Caltrans. Obviously, a massive department to try to change. But what was happening there is that the bike and ped facilities were being put in the planning phase on almost all of their projects. I mean, any reasonable project had it. But as the project proceeded and value engineering occurred, pretty soon you'd have a sidewalk on only one side and not two, even though there were destinations on both sides, or you wouldn't have anything at all. If the right of way isn't sufficient, it's like kind of tough luck. The priority is the cars. And what we ran into both in Caltrans and all over the place is that and somebody mentioned this before the break about fear of reducing sort of level of service for cars or the speed of throughput. If we have crossings or speeds that are making pedestrians unsafe, then we have a conflict and people, either the traffic engineers or stakeholders, call us to task. And unfortunately, often it's the bike and ped facilities that do not succeed. We even have, but even if it were sort of a more mundane case of people trying to do the right thing is, oh, I see a good question. I'll come back to that in just a second, Diana. But there's a standard of traffic control devices called a warrant. When is a stop sign warranted? When is a crosswalk warranted? That kind of thing. And for bike and ped facilities, often the warrant requires that either people are already crossing the street before you accommodate them, or there have been some crashes and people have been killed before they've gone across. It's almost like saying, we won't build the bridge unless people are already swimming across the river or are drowning in the river. And so warrants, unless you look at them and revise them appropriately, are going to often stand in the way and create this, this impediment. And so the question in the chat just now was there level of service standard? Let me go back to it. Level of service for all modes. Yes, there are. And so the multimodal level of service in Florida is an example of that. And when it came out, probably in the 90s, I think I don't know, it's been decades. It was kind of like the bee's knees. That was like, okay, we're going to even the playing field. We got a level of service of cars over here. And now we got level of service with bike and ped as well. And so now we've got some standard. That is okay. Obviously, it depends on what the level of service standards are. And over time, they have evolved to be better. Originally, the level of service for pedestrians was uncrowded sidewalks, because that's what we want on roads, right? We don't want crowded conditions on the roads. We want to get through the light on the first cycle. And so uncrowded sidewalks. Well, that makes no sense. And it's a capacity manual now has better things for that. And even the National Highway Capacity Manual has some of this in it. But it's very limited in what it's going to solve for you. It is going to give you some standards to go by, but it is not going to guarantee that you create a network with the facilities that you build. It is not going to guarantee that you have enough crossings, or that the wait times at the crossings are not unbearable. So the LOS route and sort of evening the score with car LOS to bike ped LOS is certainly worth looking into, but I would just not expect that to be the be all end all. Let's see, there was another question. We can track down the multimodal LOS for you. Oh, and the warrants, you know, if you have a law in Arizona that says you got to follow the MUTCD, maybe you do. In California, they have their own, and a lot of it is cut and paste from the federal, but they have the ability to change it. Lots of cities have relaxed the warrants for crossings and pedestrian facilities from what the standard generic federal one is. It's also, you know, useful. You guys are stakeholders to MUTCD, so weighing in with the bodies that set those can be really helpful. The whole standard setting around speed limits is right now in flux, and so it's not a warrant issue, but the more people who can weigh in on the side of NACTO for safe speed limits as opposed to the 85th percentile, you know, that's always helpful at the national level too. So, but those are great questions that for just an initial response to some of those, but we can come back to some of those more in the future. So please do keep putting those in the chat. If I get to them briefly now, that's great. If not, we'll come back. And then, so the next one is back to processes. We have, it's easy for DOTs or any government entity who's being called on the carpet or trying to change to say, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to do more consultation with the community, and they'll tell us, and we'll do that. And consultation with the community is great. As some people already alluded to, that kind of can take you down rabbit hole of getting all the people who have a lot of time on their hands and come out. It's also a real burden on people who might work 2 shifts and really be burdened by the transportation system to also come out and direct you as to how to best serve their needs for in terms of equity and access in complete streets. So we really need processes and standards that make things better, make the default better, right? So that it isn't on the community to beat you up every time and force you to do the right thing. You should be doing the right thing by default. And so that's what we really want to go to from here. So next slide, please. So this goes to the question of like, what's the warrant for even a crosswalk? Nobody's walking here now. Kind of covered this already. We need new ways to figure out what perhaps latent demand is for a particular crossing. The tool that we use a lot is Access to Destinations tool that can tell you that if we put a crossing in here, you would get a certain benefit. I'm going to show you a little bit about that in just a second. Next slide. Standard about like, what do you do every time you touch a street? If every time you touch a street, you improve it for completeness, and you don't just put it back the way it was. Here we've got somebody putting in a new ADA ramp. That's great, and that is what I refer to with MassDOT. Not only do they say whenever we do a paving job on the state highway system, we put in crosswalks where the bus stops are, but we also add bike and ped facilities, and there are boundaries around that about what they have to do. And if you don't do it, if you're the engineer in charge of that project, you have to go to the Secretary of Transportation and get permission to not do it. So pretty much like maybe the facility is in the middle of an industrial park and it's only, you know, big trucks coming in and out of a gravel pit. You know, I don't know. That might be something that you wouldn't have to do it. Middle road to the airport where you can't walk into the airport. I don't know, something. But in every other case where you have a surface facility, you got to go back and retrofit it. And we've gotten a lot of bang for the buck here in Madison about making that happen on every single paving project of any consequence. But got to say, that can't be the be-all end-all either, because that doesn't bring you to necessarily to a system. So next slide. This is the sort of systematic look at access to destinations. And I'm not going to go deep in the weeds, but if we wanted to deal with this in a module, I think we already are planning to. But what we're looking at here is basically walk score. It was something we created. It's not the commercial walk score that you see if you go to rent an apartment, and it tells you have an 80 walk score. So you millennial should come here because you're going to be able to walk to the Starbucks or the bars. But it's similar, and it's a 1 to 100 scale. And what we have here is Virginia Beach, Virginia. The city of Norfolk, which was the original big city in the area, is over here to the west. Beachfront is to the east. This is all a suburban area, Virginia Beach, Virginia. There's a nice old node of activity here. It was on old Route 58, which is a US highway. I forget the cross street's name, but it was you know, back when this was farms, there was a little node here, and it grew into strip malls, and there's offices. It's pretty much, if you lived there, your walk score would be about 100 because you would have everything close by. Now, it isn't lovely. It is kind of strip mallish, but you know, that's a different question. But these people over here who live on the other side of Interstate 264 would have a pretty good walk score. It would at least be in the, you know, up to 50 range. But for the fact that 264 is there, and it's a hard boundary. So one of the things that you could do is look at, not only should we be completing the streets as we build them and rebuild them and move along piecemeal, but where are the big gaps and what needs to be filled in? And this could be an analysis you do for subpopulations too. You could look at where are low-income people who have an extra burden in operating a car, and do they have access to food, and what can we do about that? Obviously, it's a land use question too. If you had better, you know, land use, if there was a node of activity over here as well, then these people wouldn't really need to walk over here to get the loaf of bread or to get whatever, to go to the bar. But there isn't right now. So two ways of looking at it in the same tool. Point being, when in flipping it, kind of going back between the optimistic, what are the opportunities for improvement, and the negative, like what are the barriers, but back to the sort of barrier paradigm. If we don't think of the whole environment as a system of land uses and networks, then we're subject to the whims of people who maybe are noisy and want the improvements, and or we do them where they're convenient, where we're already doing work, where it's cheap, but not where they're most needed. So that's a significant barrier in terms of practice and process, but the one that can be overcome. So I think we're at a point where we wanted to take a quick break for reaction. Yep.
So this is Diana. I think I want to start here. I'm the one posing all the questions, but I'm real interested in part of our complete street is coming up with defining the level of services for all the different modes. One of the challenges, and I think it was raised earlier, was, and I think Jonathan was the one who raised it, or maybe it was someone else and I have it wrong, about the fact that the results of the survey actually said, people want the streets, they want the different modes, but they still want to be able to move fast. So I'm very interested in how we could, since maybe a level of service hasn't really been established, and I moved from Florida to here, so I'm familiar with the multimodal level of service in Florida. It's really not useful. So I'm very interested in how we could develop some type of multimodal level of service that we would be able to provide as a guideline and establishing the priorities for the streets as we go into design. And I'm just wondering if you, in your experience, and if you have seen where maybe another city or another town or even a state may have something other than what Florida did, because Florida, they have it on paper, but they don't practice it, I guess is a good way to put it. That would be my question.
Right, we can bring examples of that. I mean, that gets in, the level of service gets into design. The capacity manual has level of service rules that we could use, and some of them aren't bad. I mean, the more modern pedestrian level of service does take into account waiting time at an intersection, for example. So it's got useful stuff in it. So yes, we'll, without like trying to answer the question in real time right now, because don't have all the things to show, we have lots of examples that would be that way. I would say that if we can talk you into entertaining level of access as in addition to level of service, or as a more robust measure of level of service, that brings in the land use and the distance, as well as just as the facility. Somebody talked about, when it's super hot out and you got to walk, quarter mile, nobody's going to do it. So proximity matters a lot too, and we can bring that in, and we've done a lot of work on that.
Yeah, I actually made a note to myself to look up access to destinations for warranting level of service. So I'm very interested in going down that route as well. And I think, but also access to destination would be really helpful also for defining some of our land use as well. And how we are designing the road to the land use to the access. So I would really love to kind of dig into that.
Do you guys have any policy goals around mode shifting, VMT, that kind of thing that we could speak to with this? Because sometimes that complete streets is a means to that end, and the two things can go together.
So I'm going to ask Patrick to jump into that, but I mean, off the top of my head, the answer is no. But we have been having conversations about all of that. So Patrick, tell me, have we put something in on the manual that kind of speaks to that. I know right now we're working on some TDM incentives that we would actually have some initiatives that would be in place to reduce vehicle miles travel and all of that. So we are working on another element of that, but it's not like really built into Complete Streets. So I'd love to learn more about that whole, bringing it all together. I really got to get rid of this background.
It's okay.
I'm gonna, Patrick, jump in here, help me out.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. There's nothing explicit in the design guideline. That is really just kind of looking at the roadway geometry. We are looking at that in the long-range planning process and Move Tucson, seeing if there are kind of performance outcomes that we're trying to achieve. We haven't really begun that discussion too much yet, but this will put it back on the radar. John?
Yeah, I was just say, I don't know, I haven't looked at the manual yet, but I think, you know, the big picture stuff with land use, and I don't see that Scott is still here, unfortunately. Scott, are you here? You're gone. I think an immediate thing that we can start doing right away, if you can get your development services department in the city to go along with it, is instantly change your standards for how some of these commercial, in particular, you know, corner developments are designed for the vehicles. I mean, I've seen them come across my desk in the county that are city projects, you know, this summer, and the standard layout is a little box surrounded by a big sea of parking with really crappy access to the sidewalk or the bus stop or the bike lane. So, you know, I think just redesigning, a really simple redesign of the pedestrian access to a front door of a store that comes off of a sidewalk or comes diagonally to an intersection, if it's a corner lot, is something that could be done really quickly and really easily. And you know, as those projects come through the city and the county and everywhere else for permits and review, we can get those starting to be built now, and it doesn't require, you know, massive change in land use laws at the state level to start, you know, having a more urbanized and compact development. It's the individual little projects piece by piece that I think can make a big difference right off the bat.
Do you all have a specific level of service goal that you design to, or that triggers a review of a road? Diana, can you let me know what it is? Take yourself off mute though.
Can you ask the question again? Because I was reading how to get rid of my background and I did, and that was the yes.
Oh, we thought you were answering. You were answering Beth.
And you were so enthusiastic.
Sorry, we were sidebarring. Sorry, Beth.
Sorry. Thank you. That was so great. Okay, ask the question again.
Do you all have a level of service target that you use when you design or redesign a road, or that will set off an alarm that a roadway needs some sort of treatment?
So I will tell you, you know, no, that's something that I want to work on and actually have us establish and have part of our Complete Street discussion. I will tell you,
and I do mean auto level of service.
Yes, we do have auto level of service. Yes, and so we will allow for the automobile to be a D if we're pushing for the pedestrian or the bicycle to be the priority. And even in some cases, I've allowed the LOS for the automobile to fail, to make the priority for the pedestrian and for the bicyclist.
And when you look at that LOS rating, is there a time that you're looking for it, or is any moment of LOS F enough to set that off?
It's at peak time.
Right, but peak time for 30 minutes at F, or 10 minutes or F, or 2 minutes at F?
It's usually, I'd like to, no, it's usually a 2-hour window. I'd love to go down to 30 minutes. That's not a bad idea.
Well, we can.
Yeah, I'd love to see what the standard actually is and read it. That would be really helpful to me.
I think that's good.
Right, now you're giving me homework.
Well, you mentioned TDM, which is also another thing in our wheelhouse that, you know, people may not connect to Complete Streets, but really there is a direct link. I mean, we're developing a program here in Madison that will make everybody who is above a certain threshold in terms of the size of the building and the number of parking stalls do TDM. And some of the TDM measures are better access to the street with the, or even a new crosswalk to get across the street, new ped and bike facilities in the neighborhood, transit passes, mixed use, all the things we want them to do anyway. So paying for charging for parking. So I'll share we did a report based on some program development we did with the city of LA on this a couple of years ago that I'll share with you guys right away. So
that would be wonderful. We're just actually building our TDM process. And so Jen and her team actually started on that about 2 months ago. And so we have a really good layout and then next steps, but I would love to maybe have a sidebar conversation, Eric, and look at what y'all have done and then kind of talk through that.
Love to. Yep. We're excited. We think it's there's been a lot of good work that's happened in California because of a new state law called SB 743, and it's replicable. So happy to share.
Yeah, that'd be
Diane,
perfect. Thank you. Yes.
Diana, this is Scott, and no, Jonathan, I never left. I just changed into Robert Clark, which is a blank screen. But I was wondering, and when you were getting all this set up, is there any discussions with the council about the 55 area and neighborhood plans in Tucson, except for the one or two that talk about the development will be designed as an auto-oriented development? Because that's numerous plans within Tucson. And these area and neighborhood plans are held near and dear to the heart of Tucsonans and keeping us captive in the 1960, 1950 development mode. So one of the things that we should take a look at during this process is how we get rid of those statements within those area and neighborhood plans that are keeping us locked in that. Because the first thing that you get into in a public discussion is, well, what does the planning document says? Well, the planning document says I'll have a 200-foot wide street capable of 80 miles an hour within a residential density of 4 to 6 units per acre. And people cling to that. So I think that's one of the things we have to get at the root of what's driving some of the design.
Yeah, Scott, but when we get the design manual done and take that to mayor and council and adopt it, can that not be the guiding document versus what's in the plan?
All we got to do in regards to the plan is consider it, but many times that consideration gets challenged to the Board of Adjustment, and in one of them went up to Superior Court. But what I'm trying to achieve here also is that the way we design subdivisions in Tucson is to 1960s, and that's going to end up with giant roads with no stormwater and really less dense housing. So this is one of the things I want to bring up. If you want to have complete streets and multimodal transportation, you have to take a look at these 55 area neighborhood plans and either refine them or ditch them to what you're trying to do. Heresy, you heard me say it again.
Okay, so Patrick, let's just make a note of that so we can run back with PDSD and put that on our radar. Thank you, Scott.
They got that those wide roads are really good for carrying the stormwater, though.
yeah, that's not, Robin, you're killing me right now. Sorry. All right, I'm going to stop.
Sensitive points here.
Owning all of this. I'm getting off.
Well, Rayla had a couple more examples of sort of generic barriers and opportunities that we could talk about. This was great. It spurred some conversation, and that maybe we'll get a little bit more. You want to take it over, Rayla?
Sure. I'll say one of them was here. I'm going to share my screen just very briefly. Here we go. One of them was on land use, and we're already starting to have a great discussion about that. And I think we should continue that discussion in future modules. It wasn't necessarily going to be a big piece of the future sessions, but I think it should be based on the discussions that are starting here. Yep. The only thing I'll point out here, one thing that I was going to say on this slide, we've already just, started to talk about in the chat. I saw some points about things like setbacks and overlays and all of that. One example that I wanted to bring up from my experience that it would be useful to hear your reflections on either now or in a future session. We talk a lot about fixing the zoning or doing overlays or that sort of thing. Beth Osborne, who was weighing in a moment ago, and I encountered some different issues when we were working with localities in Central Florida, where some of them actually had excellent or good enough zoning in place that was just completely meaningless because their elected officials wanted development so badly that they would waive all of those good requirements. And they didn't, maybe there was some education needed about why some of those requirements were in place. People didn't really see the purpose in maintaining the complete streets vision that they'd sort of agreed to in theory as a community. So they ended up not really getting the benefit of pretty good zoning ordinances and overlays. So just something to think about.
Well, and just to jump in real quick there, one of the things that I found really interesting, because we're thinking of a particular community that put together a beautiful form-based code, and then their council just accepted everybody out of everything in it all the time. In their former code, to be accepted out of rules required some sort of study or effort or expenditure by the developer. In the new code, it took none. So just kind of thinking about what those various levers are for change, before you create an exceptions process for the thing you want, finding out why an exception would be good and asking that to be studied, like we do with the current 100-year-old zoning policies, can be helpful to make sure that a change in leadership doesn't undercut everything that you set up.
And it's not just zoning. One of the best things we did here was redo the subdivision ordinance. So we don't have cul-de-sacs anymore. They can only be like a couple 100 feet long. So basically, maybe in a corner of some place where nothing else works, but generally we don't have them. We have the connectivity. We can't have like a subdivision that dumps everything out into one arterial, that kind of thing. So it sounds like Rayla, sorry to step on your thing, but it does sound like there's a good conversation to be had on setbacks, another good topic, and all of those things.
While I have the floor, I'm going to move on to my other challenge in a second. I got feedback in the chat that I think is really useful feedback that all of us instructors, but also those of us that are in the transportation field should really make a conscious effort to spell out the acronyms that we're using, that we're throwing out, like MUTCD, LOS. Not everyone on this session is a practitioner, so we should do a better job, all of us, of breaking down those terms. So that was excellent feedback that I appreciated.
I'm sorry to drag you into the world of these horrible acronyms.
So LOS is level of service, which is a measure of vehicle delay, essentially. And then MUTCD is the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, which has standards for traffic operations. That's my butchering explanation of what those particular terms mean. There were probably plenty of others that we said, and we will commit to doing a better job of that. We don't have a ton of time left. Fortunately, this is a topic that's also already come up in the discussions, both this question and concerns about displacement and how to bring vulnerable groups into the conversations around complete streets. So I think we'll spend a lot of time on this in a future module as well. We were already planning to spend some time on this, but I think this deserves a lot of attention. So both this topic and land use, we will commit to having robust conversations set aside for in the subsequent modules. And because we're almost at time, I thought I would give folks a final chance to raise any other responses to those particular barriers that we want to talk more about. Anything else that's come up that you want us to address, hopefully in these future sessions, before we adjourn for this particular one.
I'll say something just based on last night's coordinating council meeting, I think it's good that you guys are going to circle back on the equity issue, because that was a lot of the comments last night was about equity and how it's being measured, how the city's draft list of recommendations for the RTA are addressing equity. So I think that's going to be a good one for the city to focus on.
And Jonathan, as we move into those conversations, which I think is something that is long overdue and something most regions are really digging into now, I'd love to hear how that word is being used in your community, because equity can mean a very broad number of things. And I fear in a lot of government work, but transportation is one of the worst. We throw around common terms that mean extremely different things to different parties, and we never define our terms. Congestion is perfect. Congestion means utterly different things to every single person that utters it, but we never define it. And equity is one too. So I'd love to get more background about what you're hearing in your community so that we can think about examples that really match the issue being raised.
I just quick thing too, like if I'm always interested in connectivity issues, especially as regards like here in Tucson where we have highway and train tracks that kind of, you know, bisect the city proper, and then the interactions that pedestrians and cyclists have to go through whenever they're near those junctions where cars are entering and leaving, or any of the crossing, how you just overcome those things that are not going away. You know, that the freeway is not going anywhere. So how some other places have dealt with those things. Thanks.
Thanks. I may just add quickly. So I work more in the watershed, stormwater, green infrastructure realm. There was a great webinar I just listened to about thinking about equity, and kind of the topic that Jonathan brought up, the huge disparities in our community. And this study, it was more of a nationwide study, just found that there's been a lot of investment in underserved communities, but because they are starting at such a far different place than more served communities, that even despite decades of investment, they are still well behind other areas of the community. So I think to me that plays a lot in thinking about the prioritization and investment of funds and where we should be doing with that, especially as it quickly becomes a political issue with our elected leaders in the areas they represent. The last thing I've been really thinking about is access to open space, riparian areas, development of greenways and new green spaces, utilizing green infrastructure, but then merging that with, you know, pedestrian and bike access ways. And how does that tie into complete streets, just for facilitating movement to these spaces or through these spaces? So I'll leave it at that, but thank you.
If I may just piggyback on what Beth just said. Beth, thank you so much for bringing that up, because I think even in this community, that term equity sometimes is used in, you know, meaning very different things. For example, one thing that we've been hearing a lot is ward equity. But then when people go on to explain what they mean by that, it sounds like what they're saying is equal distribution of resources to each of the city wards, which is a different concept than equity, you know? So I think as a community, we probably need to have a lot of conversations around these terms and kind of create, I guess, collective definitions that represent the values. And I suspect those conversations will continue beyond this, this workshop series. We're not gonna, you know, this is not even like everyone here, right, that needs to be involved in that conversation. But I think, I just wanna say, like, I just wanna flag that and say thank you for bringing that up. I think it's an invitation to dive into it a little bit more and carry that conversation forward.
Well, I think we're about at time. Emily, do you have any closing remarks you want to deliver before our adjournment?
Yeah, thank you, Rayla. And thank you, everyone. I just want to say that this has been a great start to the conversation. Again, this is the first module, so we have 4 more scheduled, and really looking forward to continuing the conversation. Our next module is going to be held on October 1st, which is also a Thursday at 1 p.m. Mountain Time. And we will be discussing complete streets in project prioritization. So we look forward to having all of you back here on the 1st of October. And thanks again for really great participation and interaction. This is exactly what we're looking for, is, you know, having these conversations. So, you know, that's what makes this a valuable time to spend. So thanks again. And thank you to everyone, to our partners. And we will see you all in October.